Okay, so today we're going to talk about public key cryptography. Um, Basically, I'm going to start off by going over like sort of some basics of encryption because I believe no other talk covers this stuff. Um, Also, just like why we don't use symmetric key encryption for everything, and then I'm going to go over like public key encryption. Quite a bit of this is going to be like sort of basic concepts which are like expanded on in other talks like RSA and Diffie-Hellman. Um, but yeah, so first off, we've got the three goals of encryption or cryptography. There are three main goals and they form the acronym CIA. So the first one is confidentiality. So the idea that only you and the person you want to send data to should be able to see your message. The second is integrity. So the message shouldn't be modified at all during transmission. And the third is authentication. So both people communicating with each other are who they say they are. Like no one's sitting in the middle pretending to be someone. Um, the basic idea of encryption is that you obscure your message in such a way that only the intended recipient can decrypt and read it. It's like, yeah, this is how we make our messages confidential. Um, and the idea is that the algorithm used to encrypt uses a key to encrypt the message, which is plain text. Actually, I should turn on the laser pointer. The plain text into ciphertext. And so that basically means that anyone without the key cannot read the message because you need the key to decrypt the message as well. Um, so anyone listening in who doesn't have a key can't decrypt and read it. So in symmetric encryption, the same key is used on both sides. So basically, yeah, you encrypt it with a key and then you basically decrypt it by just inverting the encryption, by basically doing it in reverse. I believe in reality it's probably a bit more complicated than just doing it in reverse, but the idea is you're using the same key on both sides, uh, once to encrypt and then once to decrypt. The simplest example everyone knows is the Caesar cipher, where you just shift each character in the message by a number of places. So the number is the key. So if we have a key of 3, then we can take this message hello and just go like HIJKEFGH and so on, and it gets this. And then we can send this, and no one should be able to tell what this is while it's being sent. And then on the other side, it you just do the same thing in reverse with the same key. So I go backwards from K to H, uh, backwards 3 spaces, and you get the same thing. That's symmetric encryption. Um, there's an important thing called Kerckhoffs Principle, which is basically a cipher should be secure even if the attacker knows everything about it apart from the key. So basically, this key is like the single point of failure in encryption. So if that gets leaked, everything's like compromised because like it doesn't matter how complex you make the encryption algorithm, like anyone can look up how RSA works. Um, like yeah, it might be hard to understand, but the basic idea is that the key is secret. It doesn't matter how complicated you make the algorithm, the basic idea of the key being secret is the same. Um, yeah, so the idea is that the key must only be known by the sender and the recipient, otherwise it's compromised. We constantly assume that an attacker is listening in on our communications. I mean, they might not be, but basically anything that's not encrypted, anyone listening in could see that, so it might as well be known by everyone if it's not encrypted. So basically, yeah, symmetric key cryptography is where we use the same key on both sides. And a key is like, so we saw before it's a number, but in reality they use huge numbers because a key is only considered secure if it will most likely take at least 2 to the 100 operations to brute force it, which is like guessing every possible key until you find the right one. So modern algorithms use 128-bit keys. So that means there's 2 to the 128 possible keys. And that is a huge amount because if you had a computation speed of 2 to the 60 operations per second, I believe that's in decimal. What is that? I don't know. It's like a trillion operations. It might even be a quadrillion. I had it written down somewhere. Um, and given that there are this many seconds in a year, so you would be able to make 2 to the 82 guesses every year. But to try every key, you need to do 2 to the 128 guesses. So that means dividing this by this, it would take this many years to try every possible key. That's about a trillion years. Um, yeah. And you can put it another way. So even just to have a 50% chance of finding the key, you would need 2 to the 127 guesses, because that's half of the possible keys. And this is well above this 2 to the 100 threshold for like a cryptographically secure key, basically. Um, yeah, so the key is the same on both sides. This is easy to do because decryption is just the reverse of encryption, basically. But there's a pretty glaring problem with symmetric encryption, which is how do you actually share the key between one like with the person that you want to send your data to? You need a reliable way to share the key so that it can't be found out by anyone else. But you can't just send them the key because it could just be intercepted, or you'd need to encrypt it again. But that would need another key, and then you got another key that you need to send. So you can't just send it. Or you could meet up in person and exchange it secretly, but that's not really practical for like modern computing, is it? Um, so basically, there's this thing called Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange, which is basically a way of setting up a shared secret key for symmetric encryption without actually needing to send the key. So this is just a simplified version because there will be another talk about the actual maths of this. But basically, the idea is that if Alice and Bob want to establish a key, um, Alice can just choose a random number, P, and then send it to Bob. So anything in the middle here can be seen by like attackers, and anything either side is just known by Alice and Bob. So it's like secret. Um, so yeah, they both know P, and then they both make like guesses. They just choose random numbers, and these are their secret values. So they're never shared with anyone because if they were, you could easily calculate the key. But then basically they each add their secret number to the shared value. So Alice does P plus A and sends it to Bob, and then Bob does P plus B and sends it to Alice. So all the attackers know is this stuff. And then to calculate the final key, they just add their own secret numbers again to what they received. So Alice takes what she received here and adds A and gets P plus B plus A, and Bob gets P plus A plus B, and that gives them the same thing, the same key in the end. But using just this information, you can't calculate this. Um, I know that addition is not secure. I'll get to that. They don't actually do this because it's, but the idea is that they've calculated the key using that by sharing information that you can't use on its own to calculate the key. Um, Basically, Diffie-Hellman introduces this idea of a sort of key pair. So you have a sort of public and private key. So the secret values, A and B, these are never shared. These can be seen as private keys because they are like vital for calculating the shared key, but they're never shared. And if they are, then the key is compromised. And the other shared values, so the added values P plus A, P plus B, they can be considered as public keys because anyone knows them. They were shared while the key was being set up, but they're also required to get the key. This might sound a bit confusing because technically these aren't keys because we don't ever actually encrypt data with these values. They're just used to derive a shared key, which is then used to encrypt data. Um, I know it might sound a little confusing. I'm just trying to clear up the confusion because Diffie-Hellman isn't an encryption algorithm. It just generates a shared key using what are sometimes referred to as private and public keys, if that makes sense. Um, Please do say in the chat if that's a bit confusing. Oh yeah, and about using addition, you would never actually use addition because an attacker can just get the information, so they can get P and P plus A and just calculate P. No, they can just calculate A by minusing P. So in reality, they use modulo operations, which are irreversible, but there's more on that in the Diffie-Hellman talk. I just wanted to cover the basic idea of how you have this sort of idea of a private and public key, um, even though it's not technically encrypting the data. So just keep that in mind. So yeah, Diffie-Hellman is great, and like because you can generate keys securely, but the problem is with symmetric encryption as a concept, you you need a different key for every pair of devices. So if red wanted to communicate with like blue and yellow, he would need a different key for blue than he would for yellow because anything he sends to blue he doesn't want yellow to also be able to read that because it's not for yellow, if that makes sense. So he needs a different key for everyone he wants to talk to. And that basically means that for n devices, you need n times n minus 1 over 2. This is a polynomial, a quadratic equation. So it's sort of like a big O of n squared number of keys, which is bad. Like that would be very annoying to manage that many keys. Um, yeah. So Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange is, while it does use public and private keys, it's still a symmetric encryption technique. So in the end, the actual encryption that's used is symmetric because you generate a shared key. So yeah, it's secure and but it has the same key management problems as any other symmetric method. So yeah, symmetric encryption is only really used for long-term session keys like messaging apps. Maybe you have like a long-running DM with someone. Um, but yeah, for short-term things, other methods are used like asymmetric encryption. So this is where different keys are used for encrypting and decrypting. Just one sec. Um, Actually, yeah, I better answer. There's a question in the chat. Why don't long-term things use asymmetric as well? I'm gonna get onto that later in the talk. There's some important things about asymmetric, why we don't use it for that. Yeah, I'm just gonna explain how asymmetric works first. So basically, in asymmetric encryption, you only need two keys for every device, no matter how many people you want to communicate with. So yeah, you only ever need two keys. And the great thing is you can communicate with someone that you've never talked to before, um, using just your key pair and their key pair. So basically, here's a simple example of like just asymmetric encryption. So using a different key to encrypt and then decrypt. So basically, it's sort of like thinking about it instead of like reversing the decryption. No, sorry, instead of reversing the encryption to decrypt, it's sort of like performing the encryption again, but with a different key so that you end up with the starting value. So basically, what if we used key 5 to shift letters with a Caesar cipher? Because this is an asymmetric example, let's just assume we can't reverse this. So in reality, this would be some process that we can't reverse. So we would go HIJKLM. Yeah, I can do alphabet. Yeah, IJKLM. Yeah, that's 5. And then you do that for every letter, you end up with this. That's the ciphertext. So we send that to our friend, but then they have to use a different key to decrypt. So what they can do, because there's 26 letters in the alphabet, they can use a key of 21, and basically they'll perform the same process we did. So they'll add 21 to their letters. They'll do the same process as encryption, but with a different value. And because there's only 26 letters, and when we reach Z, we just loop back to A. So basically, that means M will loop right back to H, and so on. So basically, we've decrypted the message by using the same process as encryption, but with a different key. Yeah. So basically, the keys in the pair must be mathematically related. So in that example, any numbers which add to 26 are a key pair because there's 26 letters in the alphabet. So anything encrypted with the first key can only be decrypted with the second key, and vice versa. And that's just in any asymmetric encryption thing, not just this example. Um, so if we instead encrypt with 21, then we end up with different ciphertext. And then we can still use a key of 5 to decrypt it, and then we end up with the original text by going like C D E F G H. Yeah, and it works. Like, so you can use them the other way around, but it must be using one key and then the other. You can't go like you can't use the key of 21 to encrypt and then use it to decrypt. That just won't work. You have to use the first key, then the second key, or the second key, then the first key. So yeah, now on to the actual topic of this talk. Sorry, that was a lot of like preamble, but basically, um, public key cryptography is just a secure form of asymmetric encryption where we treat each key differently. So the everyone has a key pair, and so you have a public key which you share with anyone. It doesn't matter if anyone knows this, um, because yeah, it's your public key. Your private key you keep secure. You never share this because if you did, all your messages could be decrypted. Um, yeah, everything would be compromised. So basically, anything that's encrypted with someone's public key can be only decrypted with their private key and vice versa because it's an asymmetric encryption. So the keys are still mathematically related, but because the numbers are so large and they're generated in a complex way, you can't just calculate one key from the other. So just because people know your public key doesn't mean they can calculate your private key. Yeah, because that would like defeat the whole point of it being private. So an example of an actual encryption algorithm that uses public key cryptography is RSA. There's a talk on like the actual maths of that and how it works. And just a note on Diffie-Hellman, it's classed as a public key cryptography technique, but it's not an encryption algorithm. So it's sort of uses public and private keys, but it doesn't actually encrypt. You use a symmetric key to encrypt, and that's used with a cipher such as AES. You don't really combine Diffie-Hellman with RSA. Well, I don't know if I'm 100% right on this, but yeah, I'll just answer this question. So in Diffie-Hellman, the public key is when I'll start with the private key is like the values that it's the value that each person guesses, the random secret number which is used to calculate the key, and the public key is the secret value combined with the original shared value at the start, if that makes sense. I'm just going to wait for people to respond. Yeah, the little values A, B from that slide are the private keys because they're never shared, but they're also really important for calculating the shared key. And then the public key would be P plus A and P plus B, because that's the combination of the original shared value P and each person's private key. Yeah, basically a combination of P and A. No problem. Right. Yeah, I'm sorry. It was just a bit confusing while researching for this, trying to like clear up the confusion between Diffie-Hellman and public key encryption. So, okay, here's the actual process for encrypting with public key cryptography. So, you can provide confidentiality, which is goal one of encryption. So, if Alice wants to send a message to Bob, she'll encrypt it with Bob's public key. So, and that means that it can only be decrypted with Bob's private key. And because only Bob has this key, then that means that only he can open the message and read it. The problem with just doing this is that anyone could have used Bob's public key to send something to him. So Bob doesn't know who the message is from. It could be from anyone. But I've made a little graphic to help us understand this. So basically, Alice uses Bob's public. Hold on, I should explain how it works. So yeah, this is the public key, and the one below is the private key. And this is obviously the message to be sent. So basically, Alice uses Bob's public key, which anyone can access, to encrypt the message. Then she sends it to Bob, and then Bob uses his private key to decrypt it. And now he knows that only he can read this message. But he doesn't know who sent it, because anyone could have used this key. So we can also use public key cryptography to provide authentication. So the third goal of encryption. So basically, we can be sure of who sent the message. So if Alice instead encrypts the message using her own private key, this means it can only be decrypted using her public key. So this isn't secure because anyone can just decrypt this using her public key, like, because anyone has this key. So the message wouldn't be secure. But the idea is that the fact that it can be decrypted with her public key means that it must have been encrypted with her private key. And because Alice is the only person with this private key, then it must have been her who sent the message. Yeah, so the fact that it can be decrypted with her public key means that she sent the message. So here's another little graphic. So she encrypts it with her private key, and then Bob can decrypt it with her public key. And now he knows that the message must be from Alice. But anyone could have done this. So basically, yeah, anyone could have done this. You can also use this method to verify integrity, which is the second goal of encryption. So making sure that the message hasn't been modified. So basically, again, Alice encrypts it with her own private key so that only her public key can decrypt it. And like anyone can intercept this and decrypt it with her public key. So anyone can read the message and change it, but they can't re-encrypt it with Alice's private key to send on to Bob because they don't have Alice's private key, right? So this means that Bob knows that if the message can be decrypted with Alice's public key, it can't have been changed because if an attacker wanted to change it, they would have to first decrypt it, then change it, then re-encrypt it with Alice's public key, no, private key, sorry, but they can't do that. Yeah, from the chat, just so anyone anyone can use Alice's public key to decrypt a message, if the message was encrypted with her private key. So I've got another little graphic here, and basically this time Eve wants to change the message. So the message might say something like, pay Charlie £10, but Eve might want to change the message to say like, pay Eve £1,000. Hold on, I'll just answer this question. Oh, right, that's fine. Yeah, I'll go into signatures a bit later. Basically, so yeah, Alice can encrypt the message with her private key, so, and then send it to Bob, but Eve can intercept the message in the middle and decrypt it. So now she can read the message and she can change it. And then, but she can't re-encrypt it with Alice's private key because she doesn't have that. She could encrypt it with her private key, but like Bob doesn't know that this message has come from Eve. Bob still assumes that it's come from Alice. So when it arrives unencrypted, Bob assumes that it's still encrypted with the private key and with Alice's private key and tries to decrypt it with Alice's public key. But it doesn't work. It doesn't give the message. So he knows that it can't have been. He knows that the message has been tampered with in some way because it's not encrypted with Alice's private key. I hope that makes sense. Um, so yeah, if we combine these techniques, then you can use public key cryptography to provide all three goals of encryption. So confidentiality, authentication, and integrity. So if Alice encrypts the message with her own private key and then Bob's public key, Bob can then decrypt it with his own private key, which means that only he can read it because only he has this key. And then he can decrypt it with Alice's public key, so he can be sure that Alice sent it and that no one else has changed it. So here's another little graphic. So Alice uses her private key to encrypt it, and then she uses Bob's public key to encrypt. So there's 2 layers of encryption here. And then she sends the message, and now Bob uses his own private key to decrypt, which basically, yeah, now he can be confident that only he can read this message, because only he has this key. And then he uses Alice's public key to decrypt this, and get the original message. And if the message is like intact, he can be sure that Alice sent this and that no one else has changed it. So I got some advantages and disadvantages here of symmetric versus public key encryption. I couldn't get them to appear one by one, but basically I'll go through them. So symmetric encryption is, of course, easier to implement and faster because basically the key is a lot smaller, like than public key cryptography. You need a very large key for this to be secure because there's only certain like mathematical key pairs of numbers that work. So you have to use very large numbers so that there's enough possible pairs. And yeah, in public key encryption, you only need 2 keys per user, no matter how many people you need to communicate with. And it also, by default, just provides integrity and authentication. Like, you know for sure that, like, Bob knows Alice sent the message and that it hasn't been changed. The problem with this, like, you might think, oh, great, this is perfect, but it's very slow on large pieces of data. So, and mainly because the ciphertext ends up being quite a bit larger than the plain text. So basically, symmetric key cryptography is usually used for large amounts of data, so like long-term communication. And then public key cryptography is usually restricted to small amounts of data. So why does the ciphertext become larger? I don't actually know. I probably should have looked that up. I'm sorry, I don't have an answer for that. I'll send the YouTube video I got this from. It's a great video. But the YouTube video said this. And yeah, so an idea you might have is, what if we kind of combined public key cryptography and symmetric encryption to get the best of both worlds? So, because remember, the problem with symmetric encryption was sharing the key. So you might think, what if we just used public key encryption to send a key, to just encrypt a key and then send it? Look, so this would be like an alternative to Diffie-Hellman. So instead of deriving the key, you'd literally encrypt it with public key encryption and send it. So that's what hybrid encryption is. So this is where, yeah, we encrypt a symmetric key using public key encryption, because you can use public key encryption with someone that you've never communicated with. And then, because we don't want to use public key encryption to send our bulk data, because that would take forever, we use the symmetric key, which we shared securely by encrypting it. We use this key to send our bulk data. Wait, has my laser pointer gone off? Yeah, there we go. So basically, yeah, if we use the same method as before to just send a key instead of sending data, then both parties can be certain that this key is secure. It's like only for them. So basically, Alice just comes up with some key somehow. There are like algorithms for this. And then she encrypts the key with her private key. So yeah, and then she encrypts it with Bob's public key and then sends it. And then no one else can find out the key because they can't, no one else except Bob can decrypt it with his private key. And then just to be sure that only Alice could have sent this, just to be sure that only these two have this key, he decrypts it with Alice's public key. And now they both have some secret key, kind of like Diffie-Hellman, except you actually send the key but encrypted. So yeah, this seems great, right? So you use the advantages of both. You use public key encryption to send a very small key, and then you use this small symmetric key to send bulk data. But the problem is it lacks perfect forward secrecy, which is basically the idea that even if an attacker manages to get this long-term secret key, they won't be able to, if it's not perfect. Hold on. Yeah, so perfect forward secrecy is the idea that all past communications remain secure even if the long-term key is compromised. So this method is not perfectly forward secret, however you say it. So if if the long-term key is compromised, then, so hold on, I did some stuff. So basically, the problem is assuming each device's like public and private key doesn't change over time, which it might, but assuming it doesn't, all of their shared symmetric keys are then encrypted with the same key pair when they're establishing keys. So if one device's private key gets compromised, all of the past secret keys they've ever used can be decrypted because they were sent. The keys that they were sent in the first place, even though they were encrypted, they'd just be decrypted once the key is leaked. And then all past communications can be seen, which is bad. So yeah, now we get onto like, this is why we use Diffie-Hellman instead of hybrid encryption, because basically, yeah, hybrid encryption, it might seem like a good idea, but it can lack perfect forward secrecy if you don't change your public and private key pair regularly. But you might as well just use Diffie-Hellman, since you never even have to send the key in the first place. You just share values to derive the key, and yeah, you can't work out the key from the values that are sent. So basically, Diffie-Hellman has perfect forward secrecy by default, as long as you use different values every time you generate a key, which isn't hard to do. So what typically happens in the real world is symmetric encryption keys are used for long-term communications, such as messaging apps, and Diffie-Hellman is used to establish this key, or some form of it. There are actually like more complicated versions of Diffie-Hellman, but they're out of the scope of this. And then once you have this symmetric key, you use a cipher such as AES to encrypt the actual data, because this is like way more efficient for bulk data compared to just encrypting it with public key encryption. And then asymmetric encryption, so public key cryptography, is only really used for sending like really small bits of data like keys. Well, actually, we just said that you don't actually send keys with it, but really small or really secure bits of data. So maybe passwords, although usually you wouldn't send a password, you'd hash it first. But anyway, or the main thing they're actually used for is digital signatures. That's what public key encryption is really used for in the real world. So, and an algorithm such as RSA is used to actually encrypt the data using the keys. And this is actually efficient for small data. It's not efficient for bulk data though. So yeah, so this is the last part of the talk, just a little bit on digital signatures. There is another talk that goes like more into this. This is just the basic idea of how we use public key encryption to handle digital signatures. So we already know that you can use public key cryptography to verify the sender of a message. So we can be sure of who sent the message because the sender can encrypt it with their own private key, and then only their public key can decrypt it. But of course, in practice, we don't use public key cryptography to encrypt the entire message because this would be slow. So what we do instead is we use a digital signature, which is basically a way of using public key encryption on part of the message. So you can authenticate the sender and provide integrity without having to encrypt the whole message. So instead of encrypting the whole message, we use a hash, which is just a small, it's like a representative sample of a message, sort of like a fingerprint. There was another talk on hashes, but basically, yeah, a hash is just the result of putting a message into a hashing algorithm. And a digital signature, the definition of a digital signature is an encrypted hash. So, yeah, basically, this is the actual process. So I've got all the notes on how it works on this slide, and then I've got the graphic on the next slide. So you can use a digital signature to ensure authentication and integrity, even when you're just using symmetric encryption, which doesn't provide these by default. So yeah, we assume that Alice and Bob each have a key pair, so public and private key, and they also have some shared secret key, so a symmetric key. And we assume that this is like secure, it's been derived with Diffie-Hellman. So basically, Alice will calculate a hash of the message and then encrypt the hash with her private key, which creates the digital signature. So this encrypted hash is the digital signature. Then she appends the signature to the message. And then, sorry, she then encrypts this whole package, so the message and the signature as one. She encrypts it with the shared key, because this is a bulk data, so we use symmetric encryption here. And then we send this data, so no one else can open it because it's been encrypted with the symmetric key. Then Bob receives it and decrypts it with the shared key. So then he has the message, but he also has the signature. And what he does is he takes the message and computes his own hash with the same hashing algorithm. So basically, if the message is the same, the hash should be the same as Alice's. And then he decrypts the signature because Alice's hash is still encrypted as a signature. He decrypts the signature using Alice's public key. So he can be sure that Alice sent this signature and that no one's changed it. And then if Alice's signature matches, so if Alice's hash matches Bob's hash, then the message must be genuine. So Alice must have sent it and it can't have been changed. So yeah, here's just a visualization. So basically, Alice will calculate a hash of the message, just some jumbled up representation of it, and then she'll encrypt just the hash with her private key. So that means that anyone who decrypts this can be sure that it was from her. And then she encrypts the whole thing with the shared key, which is this icon. And yeah, so we've got two layers of encryption again, except the actual message isn't encrypted with either of these key pairs because that would be inefficient. So then it's sent to Bob and he uses the secret key, the shared symmetric key, to decrypt it. So now he can be sure that only he can read this. And then he calculates his own hash of the message. And then he takes Alice's public key and decrypts the signature. So now he has Alice's hash. And then he can compare the hashes, and if they're the same, then he knows that this is a genuine message from Alice. Oh wait, there's just a question in the chat. There's only one shared key. I've just put two icons because each of them have it. They both have this key. Yeah. We're like assuming that they've previously established this key securely with, say, Diffie-Hellman. So, yeah, by using a digital signature alongside symmetric encryption. So this is like the public key cryptography part, and this is the symmetric part. Bob knows for sure that only he can read the message, because the shared key was established using a secure public key cryptography technique, such as Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange. And he knows the message can't have changed since Alice sent it, because the hash he calculated was the same as the one she sent, and only the same message would give the same hash, unless you have a collision, but that would be very, very rare. And the message must have been sent by Alice because the signature was decrypted into the hash, which was the same, using her public key. And this means that it could have only been encrypted with Alice's private key, which only she has access to. So only Alice could have sent the message. So overall, public key cryptography ensures all three goals of encryption are met. So the first point ensures confidentiality. Only Alice and Bob can read the message. The second point ensures integrity. The message isn't modified at all during transmission. And the third point ensures authentication. So Bob knows that Alice sent the message. Okay, just one last slide. I just kind of want to go over a sort of real world example. This is what might happen if you wanted to send some important data to your bank. There's probably more to it than this. Like in the real world, there's like more complicated algorithms and everything. But based on what I've talked about here, this is like a rough estimate of what happens. So basically, the bank server will use Diffie-Hellman Key Exchange to establish a shared secret key with you. And the bank provides a digital certificate. More about this in another talk, but basically this just means you can be confident that you're actually talking to the bank. And the thing about this is it's signed with a public key encryption algorithm such as RSA. And when I say signed, I mean they send a signature along with it, which means you can be sure it's from the certificate authority. They haven't just made up this certificate. And then basically because you're sending your data to the bank, you first calculate a hash of your data using some hashing algorithm like SHA-256. I think that's how you say it. Then you sign this hash using your RSA private key. So you just encrypt the hash basically and then append it to the data. And then you use a cipher such as AES to encrypt the data. So all of the data, the message and the hash, using the secret key. So you're using symmetric encryption on bulk data. Then you send it to the bank. No one else can see it. And the bank decrypts the data using the secret key by basically running the AES cipher in reverse. The bank independently computes a hash of the data, of like the actual message, not including the hash. And then after that, the bank decrypts the signature you sent using your public key. So just to be sure that it's from you. And then the decrypted hash, so your hash, is compared to the bank's hash. And if they match, the bank will accept your message. Otherwise, if anything goes wrong, your message is rejected because it's not from, it can't be verified that it's from you, basically. The whole idea is that we want to verify that, yeah, only you could have sent this data to the bank. You're not trying to fake anything. But yeah, that is it. Sorry, there's a lot of rambling about things that weren't public key cryptography, but they are all important. They all like come into it, if that makes sense. I hope you enjoyed. Thanks for watching. Any questions, actually? I'll just wait a minute, see if anyone says anything in the chat. I mean, if there's no questions now, I guess maybe you can just ping me. I'm usually on Discord. Also, I'll send out the videos that I used to make this because they're really good. Just in case you want to make sure this is all good. Yeah, thanks for watching.